Hi, everyone. I'm Rena Ninen. Thank you for joining us. President Donald Trump is suggesting he will take action without Congress with just 2 weeks ahead of the next government funding deadline. Well, right now, lawmakers are working to reach a deal on border security by February 15th. After the standoff between the president and Democrats led to the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. But today, the president called the negotiations a waste of time. He claims some of the wall is already being built and that he might go around Congress anyhow.
One of the things we're considering, obviously, is a national emergency. And it is. It's an invasion of our country of not only people, not only gangs and criminals and human traffickers. It's an invasion of drugs into our country.
Joining me now, CBSN political contributor Zeke Miller. He's a White House reporter for the Associated Press. So, Zeke, the president says he's still considering that national emergency. He has already called the committee talks a waste of time. What's the sense with this decision process? Where do you think he's headed?
Well, talking to White House officials, they said the president never put a whole lot of stock in this congressional negotiation period, this 3-week deadline under the short-term continuing resolution agreed to last week to end that shutdown, and that he's always sort of been moving toward the direction of the national emergency, and he's just trying to give Congress one last attempt at it to try to give himself the most leverage when it gets to that process. And that makes sense because the underlying political dynamics here haven't changed for the president. If anything, they've gotten worse since the beginning of that shutdown almost 2 months ago now. So from the president's standpoint, there's not a whole lot of reason for Democrats to deal with him. He's going to have to act on his own if he's going to have a prayer really of getting that wall built.
He's also touted that contracts are already going out. The wall is being built despite the 35-day shutdown. What do we know about that, and what's the strategy there?
There's certainly some contracting being done on already appropriated wall money and part of the continuing resolution from last year. Then there's also fencing and other barriers that DHS is constructing, as well as the military is helping out with some concertina wire in some parts between border crossing points of border crossing. But it gets to all of that. The president saying that the wall is being built. It undercuts at a certain point his own argument that he needs to declare a state of emergency to build the wall completely. This is ultimately probably going to end up at the courts. That's what the president's own advisors believe will happen. And the argument that the president's legal team is going to end up making before a federal judge is the wall is being built, but it's also an emergency, and and he's waited only until Congress couldn't act to get it, not when he declared it to be when he said publicly it was an emergency. Logically, it doesn't really flow for the president. This is a political question that the president's trying to solve with this extraordinary emergency declaration, and that's going to be a bit of a problem for him when he goes before a judge.
I want to ask you about these comments that was made by conservative Ann Coulter, who said, "We put this lunatic in the White House for one reason," and she's pushing really hard for this wall to be built, and went as far as to even suggest a primary candidate to oppose the president, Representative Mo Brooks of Alabama. Is the White House concerned that something like this is coming from someone like Ann Coulter?
The president is certainly very concerned about his base in general, and Coulter certainly has been getting a lot of traction as one of the lead proponents from the right on this. But the president's more concerned about the rank and file base. He needs to be able to make the case to his voters come 2020 that he did at least everything in his power to get the wall built, or that it's under construction, and then have them adjust the promise that he made to voters back in 2016. That's sort of the working theory of the case among the president's campaign team right now, is that his voters will give him a pass as long as he's perceived to have done everything possibly in his power to build a wall. That will be, and also he's not right now facing a Democrat. If it's down to a head-to-head matchup between the president and a Democrat, the president's advisors believe that the president's base will be motivated to show up to the polls regardless of the status of that campaign promise. So it's a wager. It's not a slam dunk, but that's their theory of the case at the moment.
Today the Labor Department announced 304,000 jobs were added in January despite the shutdown. The president's tweeting it's actually the strongest economy in the world. Is this argument and these tweets, does it help him?
It certainly helps the image the president is trying to project, which is that he has led this mushrooming sort of explosive American economic growth since he was sworn into office 2 years ago. That's a bit of a selective reading of history in the sense of this recovery since the Great Recession has been going on for several years before he got into office, but it has accelerated. And in some parts, it's become because of tax reform. In some parts, it's because of all the other programs that have been been implemented and continuing. But at the same time, there were signs of softening over the last several months. There was the downward revision to the December numbers. There was the shutdown and the economic costs associated with that. What that number could, potentially what that job number could have been had there not been a government shutdown. All of those things, it's a mixed message. The president obviously would like to sort of billboard the top line number, but there are beneath the surface there are at least several reasons to be a little bit less exuberant than the president has been.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is suspending its participation in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia. I want to play for you what the president had to say about it.
One side has not been adhering to it. We have, but one side hasn't. So unless they're going to adhere, we shouldn't be the only one. I hope that we're able to get everybody in a very big and beautiful room and do a new treaty that would be much better. But, because certainly I would like to see that. But you have to have everybody adhere to it.
What went into the decision? Why now? And what do you think it means for U.S.-Russia relations?
Well, certainly it does increase tensions between the U.S. and Russia at this pivotal moment. The Trump administration is not the first U.S. administration to find that Russia was testing the limits or outright violating the INF Treaty, which is sort of credited with reducing tensions during the Cold War. But this has been a persistent argument of among U.S. foreign policy professionals for several years now. The president's announcement was quickly echoed by American allies, but the president's response to that diagnosis of Russia's violating the treaty was particularly Trumpian. It was the threats and then ultimately announcing that he was going to pull the U.S. out of the treaty. That is not necessarily something that you would see other U.S. presidents do. They might try to pressure Russia in some other ways. But everything with President Trump often is a negotiation. Is this just sort of another negotiating ploy to try to bring Russia back to the table, or as the president said, also bring China to the table and give up some of its intermediate nuclear missiles? That remains to be seen. It doesn't appear likely that there's a ramp to sort of an on-ramp for those sorts of talks at the moment, but certainly increasing tensions and is the sort of thing that is a particularly Trumpian response to a problem that the whole world really agrees sort of Russia was violating that treaty. You
look at something like the Iran nuclear deal and how hard it was to get that together. How hard would it be to get a new treaty with Russia at this point?
It would be particularly difficult since Russia has invested billions and billions and billions of dollars in those weapon systems. At the same time, the U.S. will have to evaluate, does it want to build up its own forces along those lines as well. It's always possible the president, this would be an area where the president could cut some sort of deal with Vladimir Putin. But the president is indicating also just in that clip that he's eyeing something bigger than just a bilateral agreement, a bilateral treaty between the U.S. and Russia on this issue. He would like to bring China and other nuclear powers into that. That is really a tall order given the nature of the separate issue of U.S.-Chinese trade talks that are ongoing now. That the president is trying to keep security issues out of. So there's only so much bandwidth any administration has for international talks, and this just might be is not particularly high on the priority list right now that we've seen.
Zeke Miller, thanks for joining us, Zeke.
Thank you.